So in today's daily portion, we're going to study the entire chapter 2. Yesterday, towards the end of chapter 1, we learned that every single person has two souls. And we learned about the first soul, which comes from the klippa, the concealment of God. And it's that soul which is the source of our vitality, the source of all of our physical and physiological needs. That soul is also the source of many of our negative character traits. That soul can also be the source of our positive, good character traits, but they're not necessarily godly and holy. Today, the Alter Rebbe introduces in chapter 2 the second soul. What's the nature of the second soul? He quotes a verse from Iyov, from Job, who says, Chelek Eloka Mimal. The second soul is a piece of God from above. It's a holy soul, a godly soul. Unless you think that that verse is just using poetic prose, the Alter Rebbe adds the word mamash, which means literally. Your soul is literally a piece of God. Now, it can't be a piece of God because God is infinite and indivisible. So it's not like you take away a piece and God is less. But if you imagine it like a flame, perhaps, where if a flame emits a spark, or if you take a candle and you light it from another flame, nothing is taken away from the original flame, and yet you have the very material of that fire in the other flame. So to your soul is that piece of God, literally, which is an amazing concept, which we need to understand a little more, because we're not God, but we are a piece of God. So there are actually two scriptural sources to explain this. The first is that the Torah references how did God create the first man with his soul, Adam. So the Torah says God blew the soul into mankind. Now the metaphor of blowing is very telling, because everything in life is created from God. Everything in this world has the creative forces of God in it. However, only a soul is blown from God. What's the idea of blowing? When I speak, I can speak for hours. I may get a little tired, but I can speak for a long time. When I blow, if I'm blowing a balloon, after a few short moments, I'm going to get out of breath and very tired. Why is that? Because speaking only emits an external, less of the oxygen within my lungs. However, when I blow, I'm digging deep into my innards and bringing out from deep within that breath. Similarly, when God creates everything in this world, it comes from a more external part of God's energy, God's essence. However, when he created the soul, it came from God blowing, which means God dug deep into his essence and transmitted his essence with the creation of a soul. That is one source for this concept. The second source of this concept is how we find several verses in scripture that refer to this soul as a child of God. Now, the child metaphor is also very telling and very powerful, because when parents create a child, parents can create lots of things. Maybe they're artists, they create art, maybe they write, maybe they produce, they build a business. You can do a lot of things, but there's nothing like creating a child, because a child isn't just coming from one of your talents and your faculties, but a child is coming from a parent's essence. A child is coming from the essential genetic material of a parent. Where's the source of a parent's sexual energy and genetic material? It actually originates in the mind, because all sexual behavior and stimulation begins in the mind. So to a soul comes, therefore, from the mind of God. Now, the mind of God is very different than the human mind. And the way Maimonides explains it is like this. There are three different components to intellect. There's the mind, the knower, the person who knows things. Then there's the power, the faculty of intellect through which you know things. And then there's a thing which is known, the subject. As the Rambam says, Mada Yodea Yodua. Within us as humans, all these three things are very different. I am not essentially my mind. I have consciousness outside of my mind. Even if a person loses their mind, they're still a person. And when I learn something new, I become a changed person. Before I didn't know it, now I do know it, and it has many changes within me. However, within God, Hu Hamada, Hu Hayodea, Hu Hayodua, all three are bound like one with God. He's the knower, he's the intellect through which that is what is known, and he is the knowledge, the subject. So there's this incredible unity about God and God's mind. So if a soul originates in God's mind, a soul is innately bound with the essence of God. Lest you think this is something you can't understand, well, that is true. As the Rambam says, we truly can never understand this concept because no human being, no person can ever truly understand the essence of the persona of God. So all souls originate, this godly soul originates in the essence of God and is a piece of God. Question: how and why is it that we find that no person has the same level of soul? Every single person has a different kind of soul. For example, you can't compare the souls of the earlier generations to the later generations. We have a concept called Yuridat Hadorot. Every generation later becomes a lower level of spirituality and of souls. And the explanation for that is because every next generation is further away from the original revelation of God at Mount Sinai. So you can't compare the souls of the matriarchs and the patriarchs, the soul of Moses, compared to our soul, right? They're much higher. Or within one generation, there are many different levels of souls. There are those that are the holy sages, the righteous tzaddikim. They're like the minds. They're the higher souls. And then there's those that are like the foot soldiers, the regular people, much lower souls. But how could there be so many different levels of souls, everyone having a different kind of soul, if every soul originates in the same source? Every soul, we said, comes from God's supernal mind, Chachma Ilah, from the mind of God. So to answer this and explain this, the Alter Rebbe brings a very interesting metaphor about going back to our idea of children and the metaphor of pregnancy. Every child comes from the mind of the parent, comes from the same place, the same genetic drop of semen from the father. However, the child evolves in a way, there are different parts to the child's body and the child's identity. So within the period of gestation and pregnancy, there are those vital organs which evolve and develop much sooner: the mind, the brain, the heart, etc. And then later in the pregnancy, other organs, less vital organs, evolve and develop. And finally, towards the end of the pregnancy, you have the nails, the hairs that seemingly are so insignificant that are born at the end of the pregnancy. However, even if it came out and developed at a later stage, it is still equally connected to the original source of this child, which was in the drop of semen that came and originated in the father's mind. Second of all, after the child is born and functioning, so the mind is a vital organ. The mind is very closely connected to the source of the soul of the child. The heart, other important organs. But these nails and these hairs seemingly seem much more detached and distant from the essence, from the soul of the child. And yet we know that all of the vitality, all of the life source that comes from the soul through the mind is still giving life to the entire, every single organ of this child. Even the nails are receiving in a more minuscule way, in a more diluted way perhaps, but are receiving their life force from the mind of the child. And the mind of the child is originally connected with the mind of the father, of the parent. So that's a metaphor to explain how it is that even though all souls come from the same source, nonetheless, every single soul is a different level soul. How is that? Because when souls are released from the original source in the supernal mind of God, they go through a whole pattern of development, of evolution, of coming down a descent from up there all the way down here into your body. And this, in a general sense, this journey is the journey of going through the four worlds of creation. The four spiritual worlds are Atzilut, Bria, Yetzira, Asiya. Atzilut is the first world of emanation, where there emerges the very first identities of some kind of creation from God, even though God's presence is very felt over there. The next world of Bria is the world of creation, the first step of creation of something from nothing. The next world of Yetzirah, the world of formation, where this creation starts to take on shape and form. And finally, the world of Asiya, the lowest of worlds, where finally we get to the actual product of creation. Now, along this journey, some souls, as they develop and go through this path, coming down to a body here in this world, are not very affected by the descent of the various levels of the world. And therefore, even when they come down here, they still retain their original identity of coming from a much higher place, from the infinite place of God's mind. Some souls are very impacted along this journey. And as they're going through this spiritual descent, which is a state of tzimtzum, of contraction, when the light of God gets smaller and smaller and smaller, some souls are affected by that. And therefore, the conscious nature of that soul becomes different and much more, the light of God becomes much more diminished in that soul versus the higher souls. Now, you can imagine there's so many myriads of levels in this journey, in this path, and therefore every soul acquires a different level, a different identity, a different spiritual power within. The next part of the metaphor is that even down here, once we're in this world and functioning, even if you're a higher soul or a lower soul, your soul is still completely bound with its origin, with its source, with the wisdom of God. How is that? Because the Torah says, Ula davka bo. There's a mitzvah, you have to connect with God in life. And the Talmud asks, how is it possible for a human to connect with God? So the Talmud gives a very interesting answer. Connect with another human, a human who's a righteous sage, a big tzaddik, a talmid chacham. Connect with them, and through them you connect to God. How and why is that? Because those great sages of a generation, as we said earlier, their level of soul is like the mind. If you could compare all souls in a generation to this metaphoric kind of body, which it is like that, and that's the unity of all souls in a generation. So some souls are like the mind of the generation, which is why we call people the head, the rush. Some souls are the heart, some souls are other organs, and some souls are the lowest of souls. They're the nails, the hairs, and the toes. By connecting with those higher souls in a generation that are the mind of the generation, and those souls are much closer connected with the original mind of God, through that you connect with your original source, which is the supreme mind of God. And that explains how, even though there are so many different levels of souls, no matter what level you're on, you're always connected with the original source, a piece of God. And it's possible that very high-level souls come into parents and families that seemingly seem like low spiritual levels, or the other way around. It could be a very low spiritual level soul may come to very high-level parents. We can never know. The level of a soul and the process of its development coming down here is not decided by us. It's decided by God. That raises one final question for this chapter. The Zohar says that the way parents engage in intimacy at the time of the creation of a soul, their thoughts, their behavior, the way they sanctify the act of intimacy, that deeply impacts the kind of soul they're going to bring into their child. Now, that's a very powerful idea. But how and why is that? We just said that the level of soul that comes into a person is decided by God, not by the parents. Does that mean to say that depending on how my parents behaved, that affects the kind of soul that I have? So the answer is as follows. The level of soul that you have is not decided by your parents, it's decided by God. However, when a soul comes down into this world and into a body, the way it interacts with your body, the way it interacts with God, the way it accesses its flow of blessings and life and spiritual energy in life is through a device called a levush, called a garment. That's its pathway. The nature of this device, of this garment that your soul, the soul of the child will have, that is impacted and decided by the behavior of the parents during the time of intimacy. So when parents engage in a holy act of intimacy, they're not altering or deciding the level of soul in their child, but they are deciding, or they are fashioning the device called the garment that the soul will have, through which it will access life in this world and access the discovery of its connection with God and with itself. And therefore, it is very important of how parents behave during this holy, important time of intimacy. So in summary, this second soul, what we know about it is that it's a piece of God, literally, and it's rooted in the highest levels of God, God's mind. On its journey down here, it may take on different identities in a more conscious way, but nonetheless, it's still completely bound up with all other souls in the generation, but with the highest of souls in the generation, the tzaddikim, and ultimately with its original source, with God. Now, what's the nature of this soul, and what are the different parts of it, the way it affects our persona, that we're going to explore in tomorrow's class, chapter 3. God bless you. Have a great day and make it a very special one.